if we reach a point that these costs of alternative proteins, particularly precision fermented foods, do successfully undercut the traditional dairy sector or the animal sector, then it will just become a no-brainer. Why would we buy the old inefficient alternative that is fraught with ethical dilemma when we have a cheaper, more customizable option now presented to us?
Okay, so Dr. Rosie Bosworth, I first of all want to welcome you to the show, and I want to preface this conversation by just saying, I guess I found you through the Milk documentary, which came out recently, and I was very interested in what you were saying, and I thought on the spot, I was like, I need to chat to her on the podcast because she'll be fantastic for our listeners, because I generally have more of a pessimistic view of humans' existence or future existence on this planet, and I'd like to try and change that a little bit. And what you were saying on the documentary did give me a little bit of hope as to how we can potentially further the cause here on our planet. So, and specifically talking around different options in terms of protein production, and probably a big issue for a large and growing human population. So, just giving you that background, I'd love to hear kind of how you got into this area, and I guess, how did all this start for you?
Well, first of all, thanks, Jackson, for having me on the show. It's an interesting question. It's slightly long-winded. How long do we want to be here for?
As long as you like.
I guess I need to preface it that I've always been a foodie and into sort of natural health and holistic health and well-being, and it seems like a bit of a dichotomy that I talk about food tech because sometimes it goes against the grain of my own philosophies. But so probably my food journey started young. I was cooking by I was about, with beaters at the kitchen by 18 months with my mum, and my obsession for baking and cooking and hosting and doing anything to do with food sort of just rolled on from there. But I ended up doing university arts and commerce degree and like getting into the sort of conventional pathway of marketing, and I think I was working for a technology company in marketing communications, and I was super bored.
Right.
And I was also, this is sort of nearly this is 20 years ago, and I was a bit idealistic at the time. I was studying, and I was an undergrad, and then I was getting into university and work and marketing, and I was like, this is so underwhelming. This is not what I want to do. I want to sort of change the world as what you sort of want to do when you're 20. And I was like, the whole topic of sustainability was starting to emerge at that time, and I thought, well, with a business lens, how do I merge the two? Environmental sustainability, my love for the environment, with business. And it kind of morphed. I sort of went back to university to some postgrad, and it morphed into some postgrad work around sustainable technology development, which I was looking at all sorts of innovation and technologies that could help industries, not necessarily in the food industry, but in, say, the transportation industry, the energy industry, construction, aviation, all these different industries, how technology could be utilized or leveraged to create a paradigm shift in that industry environmentally or sustainably, but while delivering radically better outcomes. And what happened is there's nothing going on in New Zealand. New Zealand's always a bit sort of behind in anything fairly technologically progressive. And so there was no supervisors here to help me with that at the time. So I looked at the Netherlands, and there was a lot of stuff going on there at the time. So I ended up my postgrad research moved into a PhD in environmental innovation and sustainable technology development. And what was happening at the time in the Netherlands was that I was looking at all of those technologies, but all this new speak or lexicon of alternative protein was starting to emerge too, and I was what the hell is that? What does alternative protein mean? And there's all sorts of technology development going on in the Netherlands around cell-based, what we call cultivated or lab-grown meat, and looking at other plant-based proteins or lab-grown proteins that could replace the need for animals and animal production. And then I guess whetted my appetite, so to speak, for what could be done with technology in the food space. So from there, I came back to New Zealand. There wasn't much to do here. Certainly not in the alternative protein space back in 2008, 2009 at that time. And I spent a lot of time in the United States working with some startups there, some think tanks in the States and the UK, one in particular called Rethink X. And it was really there that all of this information and all these advancements going on in the space were starting to happen, and I was like, well, what does that mean for New Zealand? What does that mean for the food supply? What does it mean for the humble Kiwi cow? So I started to sort of develop a thought leadership position and develop some experience and startup expertise in that space. So I then went back I started a startup here at the time in plant-based dairy. It didn't quite get off the ground as we'd like, and I still advise in a number of startups in the future foods space now, particularly around alternative proteins. So, and I've done a sort of a mishmash of other jobs and startup work in the meantime. So that's sort of how it came to be, but it was sort of like this divine intervention of my a love affair for food, but also how that sort of intersected with technology and my university work.
Yeah, that's a really cool story. It's interesting to me that even like you were saying, 2008, 2009, like a lot of these technologies were already being looked at and like sort of researched and sort of underway. Whereas at that time in my life, like I didn't even know what, I had no idea about like plant protein or alternative protein or anything. Yeah. I wasn't vegan in myself or anything along those lines. So it's so interesting to me that a lot of these things have actually been like, I guess, in the pipeline for a long time. Do you feel like in regards to your shift into kind of the sustainability sector and then going into this technology sector, do you feel like a lot of these kind of new technologies and things like that are as a response to like a growing concern about, I guess, climate and the future and things like that, or do you feel like it's more just driven by like economy?
There's a good question. You could probably divide that into two parts. The early stages of alternative protein, and when we talk about alternative protein, we will talk about it later as well as plant-based proteins. That's one form of alternative protein. We've also got precision fermented proteins or lab-grown, quote-unquote, proteins, which we call cultivated meats, and other forms of alternative proteins, and not to exclude traditional proteins like tofu or tempeh or whatever as well. They're slightly different. But at the initial stages of all this development, particularly with the Impossible Burger, which many of our listeners would understand or know what is now, or the Beyond Burger, which is plants, and even some of the world's first lab-grown burger, including Upside Foods, which used to be called Memphis Meats, and Most Meats, which is a spin out of the University of Maastricht, where I was working and studying. They were largely due to environmental and ethical concerns. Pat Brown, the founder of Impossible Foods, is certainly driven. His motives are essentially ethically and environmentally driven. He sort of wants to make the cow obsolete, to return nature to its natural state as much as it can, to provide a more ethical way of producing food. And that's the case in Holland, a more environmentally friendly or sustainable way of producing food, because they are very environmentally constrained in Holland. So at the start, we see this big wave coming in, probably let's say up until the last couple of years ago, when alternative proteins became a lot more in vogue and of interest to venture capitalists. Before that, it was largely sort of esoteric. But now what we see is that there's huge money to be made in alternative proteins, particularly by big food, if they can come in and harness this technology in a way that is able to undercut the current system and provide mass market solutions for the world. They're coming in and looking at it. I would we would all like to say that they're coming with an environmental sustainability angles, but it's a money opportunity for them. So capitalism's now entered alternative protein.
And it's something that I bring up with friends frequently, is this idea that a lot of because a lot of us have come to this sort of pattern of eating and this lifestyle due to ethical concerns, and this idea that a lot of the biggest shifts in how we use and exploit animals in history have been have developed via just technological advancements. Like instead of using like whale oil for lighting lamps, we started to use electricity for our light bulbs. So these massive shifts in technology have actually made certain animal use obsolete, and so it's not always, and it's generally very not frequently the case that any kind of like social justice kind of crews have really made a huge dent, I would say, and a lot of the issues around the ethical side is more so that these big technological shifts, which is why I'm kind of excited about these new options, because I believe that it potentially will be a way that we can move more towards relying less on animals for our protein. But I did want to, I guess, maybe to lay the foundation here is just to get your thoughts on like what is like I guess the biggest issue we're facing right now in terms of our food system, and I guess how do these alternative meats or alternative proteins, I should say, factor into that kind of discussion?
Yeah, I mean, the food system, as you probably know, is immensely complex. Everything about the food system, from the growing of seeds right through to the raising of crops, to the processing, to the distribution, to everything about food, particularly modern day food, is highly complex. But if we're talking about the food system, particularly in the context of alternative proteins, future foods, then we're particularly confronted with at the moment the environmental and ethical impacts of food production, particularly animal production, be that, more in particularly dairy production, but also red meat, could be factory farmed poultry, pork, or anything. And what we look at, what we know to be true, is just how environmentally devastating animal farming can be, even the best type of animal farming. There's a huge amount of water use that goes into the production of animals. They require incredibly vast amounts of land, most of which, if you exclude New Zealand from the equation, is given to animals via deforestation, particularly in Brazil. Large countries like that. If we're looking at the humble cow, particularly beef production or dairy production, they also emit a lot of greenhouse gases through the methane, through farts, burps, all sorts, and the energy use of producing these animals, and also then right down to the ethical concerns of the hundreds of billions of animals that are slaughtered every year for our consumption of meat. But if we look at the food system issues beyond just protein, you've also got issues with monoculture crops, huge vast amounts of deforestation now going on to grow soy or other beans or grains, pulses to feed animals. You have a huge amount of processed foods going on in our food system now. And that whole lack of transparency around health, huge amount of pesticide uses going into even what we feel is healthy food. So even sort of benign food production is is going south in terms of a health perspective. And, anything from like just the lack of transparency of our food supply, what's going in it, and the fact that it's dominated by a small amount of highly, highly powerful, very capitalist-driven food cartels. Nestle, ADM, General Mills in the States, Coke, Pepsi, Tyson, Mondelez of the world. They own such an incredibly large portion of our food supply, and the cost at the end of the day for them is the bottom line. Yeah.
So, as I guess a follow up to that question, because it seems quite overwhelming when you do talk about these kind of big kind of food cartels that control everything, and there's so much money involved, and obviously that leads to a lot of greed and not always the best intentions in mind when you're going about producing products for human consumption. I'm wondering from your perspective, like how much does I guess the individual personal choice actually affect kind of food systems. Like for someone like myself who has chosen to eat a certain way, like what's your perspective on how much influence that actually has?
I think that we underestimate how much influence we have as an individual. For example, because there's been a large consumer shift and interest towards alternative proteins, particularly the Gen Zs, the younger generation, and the younger millennials, that has since sparked more VC interest. It sparked more big food interest to invest in that space or shift their options to at least offer alternatives into the market. And so I think what's really important is that we absolutely opt out of the traditional food system as we know it, where we can, in instances that we feel it is not right, be that from an environmental perspective, be that from a processed foods perspective, be that from big food. Are they really, sort of, so to speak, reaming the local food producer or the humble consumer? How can we opt out of those cartels? How can we opt out of buying Nestle when we have to? How can we opt out of using the supermarkets in New Zealand when we need to and support our local farmers, or even just an independent food chain? Keeping in mind that food's incredibly expensive, so we often don't have that choice. But it's when you start to see one of those key factors of investment or at least movement in the market from a commercial perspective is when the consumers start to shift. So if we as a conglomerate of consumers shift, then you will start to see some movement. And I guess New Zealanders, we often feel a little bit powerless. You've seen it with many things in the past. But if we actually all bandied together and went, no, there's a different way, we demand a different way, I do believe that you would get some more beneficial change.
Yeah, I guess you do see that the purchasing power of the consumer is pretty strong, and just in regards to, like, you see more and more of these products appearing on our shelves. And from my very low level understanding of food systems, I'm assuming that because the demand is there, they're coming with more products. So it's a case of I'll go out of my way to potentially buy some of these products so that we can maybe start to get more of them out there and start to continue to grow this whole thing. But maybe now we can shift and go, okay, what are these? You mentioned before there were these kind of two different categories of alternative proteins that we have. I'm assuming there's your plant-based alternative proteins, and then there's these other options such as cultivated meat or precision fermentation. And I'd love to sort of cover those and go into each one of those and sort of flesh out what they actually mean and what they produce as their products. But maybe we can cover off these two different areas of alternative proteins.
Sure. I guess it's important to say before we talk about these technologies, I guess in a general sense, is that they are very, very new to the market or very new to science or research. So some of these sort of sweeping figures we hear about the environmental impact or the potential sustainability benefits are yet to be proven. We still needs to be tested at a mass scale. And as with any new technology, we have yet to see any unintended consequences of what these technologies, even though theoretically they're proven or they could be better, they still may have many unintended consequences that we yet aren't cognizant of or aware of. And we can talk about those after I go through them.
Yeah.
So did you want me to talk about plant-based proteins or go through?
Well, maybe we can start with what determines if it's, or these different categories, I guess.
Yeah. So I'll start with plant-based protein, but plant-based protein, in my opinion, probably won't be the game changer for the food system, for the food industry. But when I talk about plant-based proteins, I'm not talking about tofu or tempeh. I'm talking about a plant-based protein that has novel new technologies that are sort of integrated into that food production method. So a couple of examples would be the Impossible Burger. That's starting. It's pretty mainstream now in terms of the consumer knowledge of what the Impossible Burger is. Maybe not so much in the adoption, but what they've done is they've essentially put together a whole bunch of different plant proteins. It might be potato, it might be wheat, it might be soy, it might be a hot pea protein, sort of the protein of the day, and they've used other ingredients to emulate that experiential, I guess, consumer experience of what a burger would taste like. But they've sort of interdispersed into that technology around, well, what's amazing point of difference in a nice juicy burger is that it bleeds. So and we can't really get that out of beetroot juice. It kind of just goes, it's a bit like when you make blueberry muffins, everything goes purple. So you kind of need some new technology to figure out how blood works in a cow and try and emulate that into these plant burgers. And so they developed, using fermentation, they developed hemoglobin, which is the molecule found in meat that makes it bloody and has that umami smell when it cooks, and it drips out the side of the burger and all sorts of stuff. And they use that inside their burgers to replicate that real experiential feel for the consumer. So that would be a plant protein. You've got Beyond Meat, which is a sort of similar, but they don't use tech in the blood, so to speak. They do use beetroot. It's a bit it's less sophisticated, let's say, than the Impossible Burger. And then you've got fantastic companies overseas. Like there's a great Chilean company called the Not Co, and they use an entire raft of different proteins in their burgers for burger fuel, or for big food, or for supermarket chains, for milk, for yogurt production, and it's bloody tasty. But what they use is AI, artificial intelligence, and they map out what the sort of at the molecular level, what those proteins look like from the animal, and then they try and map that out with the closest plant molecule, and then integrate it into these beautiful plant-based products on the market. So, and that's called the Not Co. They're really going strong. They're a Latin American company to start, but they've done a lot of their R&D in the States, and they're fantastic.
Amazing.
So you've got that plant-based protein market. That could be dairy, it could be meat substitutes, whatever. Still, even though we talk about plant proteins and it's really trendy at the moment, we're actually not seeing the consumer adoption as we'd like, and that's mainly probably due to price and also the experiential factor. I'm not going to buy it if it tastes like crap, if it doesn't feel like a normal substitute right now. So, and I think that's probably similar to most consumers on the market, especially if it's priced at a higher price point. So you've got those plant proteins, and then you've got more sophisticated technologies, or more novel technologies, I should say, which are producing proteins, but not out of plants. Well, actually, some are. So I'll go through them. But that, in essence, they are animal proteins produced without the animal. So we have cellular agriculture, which is one form of producing these animal cells without the animal, and that's taking us, I'm going to use really layman's terms here because this is a mainstream podcast. It's not for scientists. We'll take a swab of, let's say animal cells from a cow, one that you'd like for a beautiful eye fillet, and you will then grow those animal cells, isolate them, grow them in you'll feed them sugars or lipids or whatever, sugars actually I should say, carbohydrates, to enable those cells to proliferate outside of the animal. So that's called cell-based meat, lab-grown meat, and they're typically grown in big fermentation vats, and that you can scale the production of that slurry, so to speak, quite well. And at the moment, we're having good success with how to produce cultivated or cell-based meats at that sort of rudimentary meat state, i.e. mincemeat, in burgers, or say that nugget, in the chicken nugget or whatever, not less so in those very textured 3D forms, that kind of stuff. So that's using an animal cell to replicate animal cells, but feeding them say sugars or whatever an animal cell would normally feed on in the body, but bypassing the cow. And then what you have outside of that is, or beyond that, is what we call precision fermentation. And that is a very, very interesting form of technology that I believe will probably surpass plant-based proteins and cultivated meat, but they will probably inevitably have a whole range of different options on market. And precision fermentation essentially is quite clever in the fact that you can you pretty much choose whatever molecule you want, and that may not even be an animal cell. I'll use milk for example's sake, but it could be a fat, it could be a colouring, it could be collagen, it could be insulin, it could be any molecule on the planet. It could be something out of a plant. It doesn't necessarily have to be out of an animal. It could be gelatin, and you sequence the DNA of whatever the molecule is that you're wanting to produce. And let's just say it's casein from milk or for dairy. And then you take a microorganism. For example, the ones that are being used at the moment by companies are yeasts, bacteria, or fungi. And you program that microorganism, let's just call it a bacteria for the moment, to express those very same DNA characteristics of that molecule you'd like. You feed it sugars, simple sugars. You feed it a diet that it needs to survive. Everything to grow, even a humble fungus, needs feedstock. And in this case, it's a sugar. So we'll feed it some sugars. It could be sugar. It could be some sugar byproduct or whatever. And these microorganisms start to express the very molecules we like. And then that, again, done fermentation vats, a bit like how beer is brewed in a brewery right now. And it just starts to proliferate. And you could do that anywhere in the world. You could do that here, legislation dependent, allowing. You could grow those proteins, say in New Zealand. You could grow them in China, right, in market of the markets that actually need them, that we export them to, South America. You could do it in Africa where there's food shortages or whatever. So it's a very distributed food model that, so is the cultivated or cell-based meat. And then you also have a really interesting technology that is called molecular farming, and it's a bit of a hybrid method where you're producing animal products or these very same molecules, but you're producing them inside plants. So you're programming plant cells to produce dairy proteins or dairy fat or whatever it is you want. And we actually have a company called Miruku here in New Zealand that are doing that. Wow. Very sophisticated methods. It's a collab between a New Zealand startup, New Zealanders and Israelis who are very advanced in this space. And they are growing really sophisticated dairy ingredients for the dairy industry that could be used instead of dehydrating all these milk solids in New Zealand and then turning them into milk products like all the baby infant formulas, the yogurts, the creams, or whatever or ice creams. You could essentially take them straight from the plants themselves instead of growing in a cow, impregnating the cow, having the cow to breastfeed, then taking the milk, then dehydrating the solids, and then turning it into, and then isolating all those different molecules out of the dairy proteins that you want. So that's called Miruku. There's another company in the States, I think, called Nobel. They're doing similar things. And the good thing about that is that you are keeping farmers farming. You're still using the land, and you're still keeping farmers on the farm, but they're doing it in a different way, and they're producing sort of these new next generation of molecules that the next generation of consumers will demand and at least be interested in. And interestingly, across those, you can tailor them. So you can tailor them to have no lactose, or you can program them to be of a specific, I guess, to have a specific nutritional outcome, which you don't really have a huge amount of options in with traditional agriculture. So it's really transforming food production from sort of the animal and the land to actually let's customize this, and having this very precise personalized food production model. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean there is so much in there, and that it all sounds so incredibly exciting. And I think I really do, I guess, agree with what you said at the beginning of that in regards to, like, I guess a lot of the plant based protein alternatives we're seeing. They're great for people like me, vegans, plant based eaters who are like, cool, want to have some of these, cool little meat alternatives. But that's quite a small little niche community. And sometimes I think, well, what about, all the people in some small town in New Zealand? Like, what about all the people living in Tikawiti, for example? Like, are they going to be going and buying,
Yeah.
the macro flavored tofu, or they're going to be
Yeah.
buying like their Beyond Meat patties? Probably not. But we're like cell based meats and precision fermentation, these techniques coming in. Why that excites me is because that will give them the exact same product they are already consuming, but just wipes out the middleman of the animal, doesn't it? And it sort of takes away all of the process that are involved with raising that animal, like you mentioned, actually feeding the animal, the water that goes into the animal, the land use, the carbon emissions from that animal, all of these things, that the transport of the animal, the running the slaughterhouse, all of that stuff, it adds up, right? And so you cut all of that out and you're left with a product that people already love and enjoy, but they don't have to sacrifice, what they enjoy, like in terms of their flavor or their convenience and things like that. But I guess a question for you, Rosie, is how far away do you think we are from some of these products actually hitting the shelf and being, I guess, comparable in price, so that people like those who I mentioned who wouldn't be, gravitating towards plant-based alternatives would actually pick something up like that as instead of an actual real grown animal?
Yeah. I probably would divide that into two sort of categories.
Yep.
One is, let's see how far off the market these would be for ingredient as protein as an ingredient. For example, milk solids, which go into, I think, New Zealand's milk that gets exported. I don't look at, you can't quote me on the exact figures, but say somewhere upwards of 80% of that, or at least 80%. Maybe even 90 is sold as milk solids, and that's not for liquid milk. Liquid milk is completely separate. That's to go into packaged goods.
Yeah.
Chocolate bars, soup mixes, potato chips, Panadols, whatever you name it, it's probably got milk solids in it. And as a protein as an ingredient will be the first one to hit the shelves, because consumers are none the wiser as to whether that's a New Zealand milk solid from a free-range cow or a milk solid that was produced via precision fermentation. And we, in fact, actually see a company in the States who started to pioneer the precision fermented dairy proteins using casein, Perfect Day. And they are already in a number of products on market, very niche still, but the prices are probably double that of if you bought a tub of ice cream, there would be double what the tub of ice cream of traditionally produced cow's milk would be. It's lactose free, it's very sort of customized, and it's already in a number of brands, but that's sort of just this is the beginning of the wave, because now they have entered into partnership. They entered into partnership with Archer Daniels Midlands, a huge food conglomerate, some years ago, to scale it up so that those costs could come down to reach a comparable level with animal proteins or less. And as you'll see with technology over time in any category throughout any industry, that technology will undercut the cow at some point. But they've also entered into partnerships recently with big companies like Nestle. And once you've got those partnerships going on, it enables that adoption, or at least the costs, to come down so much more quickly. And when that happens, then the cost will come down and the adoption starts and the scale up starts, and it becomes sort of like this inevitable shift towards this new system, especially for ingredients where consumers don't know or don't care about what is going into their chocolate bar. So dairy will be the first cab off the rank. We're seeing it on market already. It is continuing to there's so many companies coming out now that are partnering with big food and big tech to do so. So I couldn't tell you when it's going to become cost comparable, but I'd say 5 to 10 years, you'll see such a shift towards precision fermented dairy ingredients. It will be quite remarkable. When we look at proteins like a steak or a chicken or something more lifelike that isn't going into a food group as an ingredient, that's where the sophistication, the technology needs to be a little bit more a lot more refined, because we can precision ferment lots of molecules. But let's say we have all the molecules in the world. Oh, look, we've made them all via precision fermentation. Fantastic, we've done it. But there's that last mile of food production in terms of like, how's it going to taste? How's it going to feel? What's the texture? And we haven't quite gone from the slurry of the molecules into the end experience for the consumer yet. And same with cultivated meat, we haven't got these beautiful, succulent, sinewy, but not sinewy is not great for meat, but just lovely, beefy, meaty cuts. And that technology is going to take a bit longer, and it will be a bit more pricey. But you'll have a whole plethora of options to choose from. It could be plants, it could be your traditional animal protein, it could be a hybrid of plant and precision fermented fats or whatever that you want to put in that. And look, the price for that will come down. A company in Israel is doing extremely well. I'll give it to you for the show notes. It's just the company's, I think it's Redefined Meat. Already undercutting the cost of lots of these meat products. But again, they haven't scaled for the world. They don't have the kit to produce this at mass scale yet. So who knows actually what the numbers are. But I would say in 5 to 10 years, the food system, whether we like it or not, whether we're food purists or vegans or we want to see this is going to come, just because it's a technological shift that is now so inevitable that it'll be a cost and a technological race rather than anything else.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And do you see a point in time where there's ever, I guess, or like you mentioned before, like you make the animal redundant? Do you ever see a point in time where people would still choose to, I guess, have a like farm slaughtered animal for their protein?
I do for the immediate future, because we still have boomers living on the planet. We have Gen X's, we have older millennials, or very old millennials like myself who might go, fuck it, I just want a really nice bit of caramelized T-bone steak with some mushrooms. And you're going to get that for a while yet, especially if your discretionary income enables you to.
Right.
What I do see, though, is that option will become much more rare, and especially in the event that the costs, if we reach a point that these costs of alternative proteins, particularly precision fermented foods, do successfully undercut the traditional dairy sector or the animal sector, then it will just become a no-brainer. Why would we buy the old energy, the inefficient alternative that is fraught with ethical dilemma, when we have a cheaper, more customizable option now presented to us in ways that we may enjoy eating even better, because we'll have other options. There'll be so many more options on the market, because we can produce more than just conventional cows, pigs, and chickens. We can produce anything with this technology.
Right.
So, but I do think that's not going to be like binary. One day it's there, and one day it's not. It'll be a gradual shift. And look, we still see the horse and cart. But would you bet the economy on, setting up a horse and cart model? No, you wouldn't. So, it's just, that'll be a gradual shift as and when social behaviours change on the market. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like, I guess from my perspective, the important part of this is scaling it to such a level that you can then provide these very, animal product hungry developing nations with their protein. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like it's not about feeding all my vegan friends in Ponsonby. You know what I mean? It's about fueling these huge nations that are just blowing up in population, and and that will make the biggest difference, I believe, in terms of climate change and effects there, and of course the animal welfare side of the equation as well. What would you say, I guess, to the as what was mentioned many times in the documentary Milked, they talk a lot about the effects on economies, right? So what would you say to, I guess, specifically to New Zealand's economy in regards to the fact that we export so much animal products? How does that affect us? How do we kind of navigate that? You mentioned before that there's potential for farmers to start pivoting into growing crops in these different different ways to use these different technologies. How does that look for a country like us?
It's a great question, and a difficult one to sort of ponder, because New Zealand, we have a comparative advantage in New Zealand, and that is land to grow food. Our competitive advantage is less defined. Growing, dairy successfully isn't a competitive advantage. So we need to figure out what we can do with our land from a food perspective that it gives us competitive advantage, and that means shifting into much more sophisticated, high-value forms of food production. When we're looking at alternative protein, already we've missed the boat, particularly in developing a lot of these new technologies. Israel, the United States, the Netherlands, Singapore, they're really leading edge in this, and it's going to be hard to catch up with them now for that basic new technology that's come on market. But where New Zealand really does excel is that we have fantastic ability to grow highly nutritious food, and we have a lot of background in food nutrition, and that could be from dairy nutrition, it could be from the nutrition that's found within our horticultural sector, black currants or other plant-based crops or fruit and veggies that we could harness in this new food, I guess, evolution. So when I think about what we can do as New Zealanders, I don't know if it's very feasible for us to go, let's just start and become a Me Too precision fermented precision fermented mince company. Well, there's lots of companies doing that now. Where's your point of difference?
Right.
It could be if you're a farmer, you could go, well, I can't grow. I don't think it's useful for me to grow cows anymore, but how about I grow the most nutritious, figure out what part of New Zealand I'm in, what kind of crops are going to grow best there to provide really highly personalized or nourishing horticultural crops that could be leveraged for bioactives in terms of not only food but plant-based pharmaceutical kind of products.
Okay.
You see, say, with kawa or manuka have all these incredible properties to them. What other plants in New Zealand could be grown that have these incredibly bioactive, potent qualities to them that enhance health? So that's sort of one angle. Then you could say, well, we're also very good at dairy nutrition, and how could we transfer that knowledge of our dairy nutrition? Typically it's stuck in the universities, though, or in big food companies like Fonterra or Synlait or whatnot. How could we transfer that dairy technology and sell that or partner with these new technology companies out there, food tech companies that have these technologies, but they haven't cracked the nutrition yet. They haven't cracked how these are going to impact on the human body when they're consumed. Are there going to be any unintended consequences? How do we make the best highly nutritious alternative proteins in the world? Why don't we partner up with them and become the sort of wellness providers of that side of the equation? We provide the wellness and nutrition to these new alternatives, and that can be in the form of IP or science or whatnot, and partner with them in that. That, unfortunately, though, doesn't typically involve a farmer. So in those respects, do we retire the farming back to the land? Is it forestry? Is it is it getting more into horticulture? And I would say horticulture has huge potential here, especially if we can increase the sophistication of our crops, of our plant genetics and all sorts, to grow some next generation highly nutritious crops for the world. So, and there's a market for that because people will pay premiums, but it's not a silver bullet, and I'm not suggesting to any farmers this is the way to do it, and then they go broke doing it. So, this is sort of just a caveat. These are just options, and I do suggest that a lot more farmers get into their offspring, or then they themselves get into a lot more STEM subjects: science, technology, engineering, and maths, so they can understand the end consumer a bit more, and sort of where they could potentially play in this new farming system that's going to become highly sophisticated.
It's I mean, it sounds incredibly complex, and something that's going to, I guess, evolve over the coming years as the food systems do change, and it's going to be a tricky time for people who choose farming as their profession, because they're going to have to, I guess, stick with the times in many ways. They're going to have to really roll with the punches there. So that's going to be a really interesting one to, I guess, see play out. But, I'm sure, humans are very adaptable, and I'm sure we'll find a way to figure this out. I wanted to ask as well, Rosie, what would you say to people who are very skeptical of all these kind of, they sound like Frankenstein foods, there's all this kind of sci-fi stuff, and they say, well, how can it be good for our health? Or, it's just GMOs, genetically modified, all of these kind of skepticism around these type of foods. How do these companies even start addressing that market and kind of putting people at ease around what they're purchasing?
That's a really good question, and it's a hard one, because even myself, look, I talk about these technologies, but I'm in no way a proponent of technologies that will take over, that eventually have ultimate control over the consumers. Big tech companies that will, change their course to food, and again control the consumer. I'm in no way of promoting technologies that may have adverse health effects on the body, all sorts of stuff like that. So while I talk about it, I'm also very pro-health, and very pro consumer autonomy, and us not being tied to the big brothers or the big cartels of the world for our food supply. It's such a fundamental right as a human. But all I could say on that is that there's going to have to be a raft of tests, of proof, of evidence, scientific evidence that this food also is good for humans. It doesn't have those unintended impacts, that it actually absorbs, it's bioavailable, absorbs into the body as naturally as it can, as healthily as it can. And I think that's where the onus on the consumer is as well, and legislators is before these are legislated for. We need to make sure that the optimal health of the consumer is put, at front of mind. But that's not always the case. It's a hard one. I think even the companies themselves will have to sort of err on the side of caution when they release these products as to how they eventually will be received by the human body. I think that there's a argument that it's a protein. How your body recognizes it is relevant at molecular level. It's the same protein. It's the same molecule. It'll deal with it. Maybe, but maybe not. So I don't know. I'm not a specialist in that area. All I can say is that there will have to be a lot of work done with companies on the legislation side, the ethics side, and the nutritional side of this, because unless you're just targeting consumers who are replacing their chicken nuggets or their quite unhealthy processed minced patty, people will demand that this food is healthy and won't have any adverse impacts on them. And until that's sort of shown, there will be that contingent of skeptics still. So, and I'm more open to it than some, but I'm still like, okay, I want some good scientific evidence that this is good for me, or even anecdotal evidence by the front runners,
Totally.
So who knows?
Yeah, no, it's going to be it's one of those things is like you don't want to kind of solve one problem and create another one. So, yeah, I mean, I guess from my very like low understanding of the whole thing is like, like you're mentioning in regards to some of these products, lab grown meat or precision fermentation, it seems to me that like, you're just getting something else to grow those cells, but the cells are identical and the end product is identical to what we would consume anyway. And then like you're saying as well, there's some level of we can actually control or create certain foods with specific nutritional properties that maybe we can't do when we are consuming a normal, natural, quote unquote, animal product. So it's like you could take milk and you could, add things to it, take things away to potentially make it even more beneficial for human health. So it's quite an exciting area from the sounds of it.
It is. But like, let's be. We also just need to keep a very sort of balanced view. Technology is both good and bad, so we need to make sure that those companies sort of dance that tightrope of it not being, not falling off on the bad side of it, which can be quite nefarious at times, particularly if the motives are cost, and cost is becoming such an enticing. Or price and cost is becoming such an enticing factor into the industry now. So it is important that both consumers and legislators really hone in on those new entrepreneurs or food companies that are working in that space, that's not lost in these new models.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Well, I think that's a really good place to sort of wrap this one up. I wanted to ask you, is there anything we didn't cover today that you think is a really important piece of information that the listeners should know about this whole area of alternative proteins?
Not particularly, just that it is exploding. We've reached record, year-on-year records of investment into the space. Each year there's just exponentially more startups working in the space. There's incredible partnerships going on between big food and startups. All sorts, so it's not something that's going away. It's become very trendy. It's become the place to be in if you're sort of in the food tech world.
Yeah.
And just to be open-minded to it, and but also keep health at the forefront, and and to really make that message. And if you are to look at these companies or give them your time of day, push that sort of principle on them, or whatever your principles may be, health or nutrition or transparency of production, transparency of use of GMOs or whatnot, so that we do get a fully transparent food supply going forward, which is fundamental for humans. Yeah.
There's probably one thing that I was just reminded of while you're talking there is, because we have a lot of vegans listen to this podcast, I assume that a lot of them, say some of these products start coming on the market and they see them on their shelves, they're probably not going to gravitate towards buying them just because they've been adopting a completely different way of eating for so long, and they're very happy with that way of eating. They know it's going to be beneficial for their health long term, and it's working for them. However, for those that do decide, hey, look, maybe every now and then I'll dabble in a piece of beef or whatever it may be that is grown in one of these cultivated. From one of these cultivated companies, are these products considered or are going to be labeled as vegan, or like how do you sort of work around that situation, considering that they don't technically come from an animal?
That's a good question, because it hasn't yet sort of been decided on. There's lots of debates around that, and it depends. It's really subjective, because it depends what your view of veganism is. Is it that your food that hasn't involved animal slaughter, or does it mean at the molecular level there's no animals involved, no matter how they were slaughtered or how the food was produced? So there's probably going to have to be a bit more of a universal agreement on what is vegan unless they just use the term animal free or something like that. Contains animal proteins but is animal free, live animal free or something like that.
Yeah.
So, and I do know that I think in Israel it was considered, the cell-based meat's considered kosher now, I think. I'll have to double check on that. But look, there's been no hard and fast consensus. And I think it's such a subjective thing. So
yes.
There'll probably need to be some sort of international naming convention or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure it'll spark debates for a very, very long time. And like you said, it's subjective. It'll probably end up being up to the individual as to, they get the information, you understand where this thing has come from, and then you make a judgment call based on your own morals and your own ethics as to whether you want to consume that or not.
Totally. Yeah.
Very good. Hey, well, is there any recommendations you have for our listeners going forward? Any other further listening, reading, watching that they might want to jump into if they're interested at all in this topic?
I do love the website Food Hack. They cover all the latest everything going on in the food space. They're sort of one of the first to sort of cover it. They're fantastic. I think if you follow a couple of companies such as Perfect Day Foods or Change Foods in the United States, Australia company, they do precision fermented dairy. They're really making some inroads in on that. If you cover Miruku here in New Zealand, or even what's the company called? Upside Foods. You'll see some cool progress going on. But I think, for the first port of call to figure out what's happening in the space, Food Hack and signing up to the Food Hack newsletter, and I have no affiliation with Food Hack whatsoever. They're a great start. It's really bite-sized, interesting, written for the layman, but really cool stuff that they sort of uncover on a really regular basis. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, well, I'll list some of those in the show notes, and then people can jump on those and have a look. But hey, well, thank you, Dr. Rosie, for coming on. Been really insightful. I guess this is probably a pretty bird's eye view of the topic, and like you said, you sort of tried to speak in a little bit more layman's terms for our listeners, which is great. I'm sure they'll appreciate that, and I appreciate it as well, because it's definitely a complex topic that is not crazy easy to understand, but I think with this podcast people can come away with it from knowing a little bit more about the intricacies of it. Where's this stuff coming from, why is it needed, and how it's potentially going to change the food system going forward. And then of course, like we mentioned, they can sort of make up their own mind as to how they choose to consume those foods. So thank you so much for coming on, and all the best.
Total pleasure.
Okay, friends, thanks for sticking around all the way to the end. I want to finish this one up by stating that while these products may be a way off from appearing on our shelves and even further away from achieving price parity with current animal products, there will come a time when it's up to each individual to decide where they land on this discussion. Whether you choose to consume such products is a personal decision, and one that no one can make for you, and one that should be made free from judgment. With the right education around what these products actually are, how they are produced, and what their effects are in the human body, I'm pretty certain you'll be able to make these decisions with a high level of confidence. I guess one thing to keep in mind here, and something that I did mention during the show, is the impact these products will have on many areas of the world where animal production and consumption is only ever increasing. As Rosie mentioned, the uptake of plant alternatives is not as widespread as we would like to believe. And while there are still potential health concerns associated with filling the shelves with products containing animal products, I do believe that by swapping the current energy inefficient animal farming model for a technologically advanced version using the methods outlined in today's episode, we can begin to see a significant change in emissions and a drastic reduction in animal suffering. It's definitely not a silver bullet, but it's an exciting step. I'll leave you to marinate on this one. As always, if you enjoyed the show, share it with a friend and shoot through a quick review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. catch you in the next one, plant friends.